Okay, I think we will get started. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. My colleague Vedika will give us some introductions, technical introduction. Vedika, please go ahead.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Interfaith Dialogue on Nurturing the Spiritual Development of Children. Please keep in mind these few housekeeping rules. Please keep your microphones on mute. Please do use the chat box for questions or comments that you would have. And we would also kindly request you to keep your cameras off too. We will be also sharing the recording after the webinar. This Interfaith Dialogue is a contribution to the World Interfaith Harmony Week. And we're doing this by bringing together diverse religious and spiritual leaders and faith actors to provide reflections on the importance of nurturing the spiritual development of children in the early years and the role of religious communities to protect children from violence and promote their holistic well-being. Again, we encourage you to engage with our speakers during the webinar and especially during the Q&A session. So, Maria Lucia, please go ahead.
Thank you, Vedika. So my name is Maria Lucia Uribe. I'm the Executive Director of Arigato International Geneva, and I will be moderating this important panel today. We have decided that it's not going to be a traditional panel where you have the speakers speaking one by one, but we'll have an interactive dialogue. And we have the privilege to have 5 panelists that are religious leaders, but also practitioners who are working in the field of early childhood, but also on community medicine, that will bring their expertise from the diverse communities that they represent. And I would like to introduce them immediately. You will have their proper bios on the chat, but I'm going to introduce all of them at the same time, and then we will go a little bit more to understand what is this panel about. So let me introduce Professor Anant Rambachan, who is Emeritus Professor of Religion at St. Olaf College, Minnesota, United States. Professor Anant, welcome and thanks for joining us. Sister Grace Mary Horan, who is representative of the Dicastery for Interreligious Dialogue, joining us from the Vatican. Sister Grace, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you. We have Sheikh Ibrahim Letome from the Center for Sustainable Conflict Resolution and legal advisor of the Supreme Council of Kenyan Muslims, joining us from Kenya. Sheikh Letome, thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much, Maria Lucia. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Sheikh Letome, we don't see you. Your camera is off, so when you can, please turn on your camera. Yeah, now we see you. Great. Then we have Dr. Siobhan Fitzpatrick, who is the chairperson of the International Network on Peace Building for Young Children and the regional vice chairperson of the Early Childhood Peace Consortium. Siobhan, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Maria Lucia.
Thank you. And Siobhan is joining us from Ireland.
Yeah, that's correct.
Right. Siobhan, right?
From Belfast.
Belfast, great. Then we have Dr. Vinya Aratne, who is the president of the Sarvodaya Shramadana movement in Sri Lanka. Dr. Aratne, thank you for joining us. Great. And so the dialogue today is a contribution to the Interfaith Harmony Week. We'll be exploring the topic of the spiritual development of children from different perspectives, as mentioned, particularly on how it contributes to the well-being of children, but also how it contributes to the protection of children from violence. So we'll be exploring important topics such as violence in the family, violence in early childhood, the role of religious communities, but also how the spiritual development of children can be integrated better in the holistic development of children in early childhood programming. We'll have an hour of where the speakers will be able to share with us some of the reflections. And then we will have around half an hour for dialogue. So you will be able to ask more questions. You can start asking questions on the chat, which will be collecting, but in the dialogue we'll be able to speak also together. In the meantime, please keep your microphones off, and we will engage in this very fruitful dialogue. I also want to start saying that when it comes to the spiritual development of children and the topic of spirituality, there is not an agreed definition of what spirituality is. Spirituality, as you know, is understood very differently in different religious traditions by different people. But this particular panel is being organized by a consortium. It's being organized by a consortium, which is the Consortium on Nurturing Values and Spirituality in Early Childhood for the protection of violence, of children from violence. So in this consortium that has been working together for 4 years or so, trying to understand the evidence on the impact of violence in early childhood, the importance of the spiritual development of children, how these two topics intersect, we have an agreed common definition on spirituality. And what we have agreed is that spirituality is not confined only to religion or to religious people, but it's something that it's for everyone. It refers to the connection and relation with the self, with others, with nature, and with that which people refer as God, the divine, the transcendent, or the ultimate. It's a spirituality that connects these multidimensional relationships, helps children to be grounded in their sense of self, and also rooted in their own communities, in their own families. It builds a sense of belonging in children, strengthens their identity, ethical values, and prosocial behaviors, and positive relationship with others. It lifts up children to develop a sense of purpose and meaning around who they are, what they want to be, and what they are meant to become. So there is a general definition in a way of spirituality, which we'll be exploring through different traditions here. And when we talk about the spiritual development of children, we see it as a central aspect of the holistic development of children that enables a gradual and progressive unfolding of children's innate ability to connect with themselves, with others, with nature, with God, the divine, in a search for meaning, for purpose, for belonging, and for transcendence. So that's maybe to get us started in a couple of definitions that are more in a more general sense. The objectives for today in particular, as I mentioned, is to explore the factors that hinder the nurturing the spiritual development of children, and to discuss very concrete ways to overcome these challenges within religious and spiritual communities. Second, we will be discussing in a way the disparities between what religious scriptures affirm about protecting children from violence, but also the types of violence that we see take place in the families in our communities as well. And we will delve deeper into the role of children's spiritual development, how it is important to protect children from violence, and also what's the role of the religious spiritual communities, but also the relationships and the collaborations we build with other sectors to integrate the spiritual development into the holistic development of children. So without further ado, I would like to start this dialogue. And we'll have a series of questions, and I will be inviting the different panelists to share. So I would like to start looking at the challenges and opportunities in the religious and spiritual communities to support the spiritual development of children. So we'll invite our panelists to talk about, from their own religious perspective, what challenges, opportunities they find in the religious communities, and any other maybe experiences in their own communities. And I would like to start with Professor Anantanan Rambachan, who is a Hindu religious leader as well, and a professor of comparative religion. Professor Anantanan, please.
Greetings, dear friends. It's really wonderful to be with all of you in this important dialogue. And my gratitude to Maria Lucia and her team in Geneva for convening us. So Maria Lucia, let me give a very, again, to allow maximum discussion, my answer will be very brief. But I want to first highlight what are some of the opportunities that arise from the unique role of religious communities. And I think there are some significant resources that religious traditions can bring to support the spiritual development of children. I'll identify these very briefly and move on. I think the first is moral authority. I think that religious leaders across the traditions enjoy a special moral authority. Of course, such moral authority weakens when religious leaders betray moral values that are commended in their traditions. But we do have a moral authority, and I think we have an obligation to use this moral authority on behalf of the spiritual development of the child and protecting children from violence. Child violence is one of our biggest obstacles to nurturing spirituality in children in the early years. Second, one might have moral authority, but with little outreach power. Religious leaders, however, combine the power of moral authority with extensive outreach to communities. Most communities, religious communities, have outreach structures in place, which can be used well for children's holistic development. Third, religious leaders combine moral authority and outreach with their role as teachers. They enjoy a unique opportunity to instruct, to inform, to disseminate beneficial information, and to challenge and to correct that are detrimental to the spiritual development and well-being of children. And fourth, I would say, in different ways, our religious communities affirm the dignity, and more than just dignity, I would say, is sanctity and the sacredness of children. So this is a very valuable theological teaching that gives a foundation for nurturing the spiritual development of children. What are the challenges? There are many, Maria Lucia, again, I just mentioned here. But one that I will lift up, and I think we have to be very honest about this, is that there are still, in spite of all of the opportunities and resources that I mentioned, there is still the persistence of teachings about children within religious traditions that are not always conducive to their spiritual well-being and their flourishing. Where child-rearing practices are concerned, we have to admit that sometimes violent child-rearing practices are legitimized and sanctioned within religious traditions. And, there are theologies of human nature which understand human nature to be corrupt and inherently disposed to wrongdoing. And sometimes violence is seen as the only way to rectify, such an understanding of human nature. While spirituality is a traditional preserve of our religious traditions, higher levels of religious commitment do not always translate into lower levels of child violence. And I think the challenge is to bridge this gap. We can't ignore this challenge. So one of our ongoing challenges, and I think this is what you are trying to do, this is what our project is all about, is convening and educating religious leaders and communities on the importance and significance of the early years in child development. And we should make accessible to religious leaders and teachers the knowledge that has been gathered empirically from research into child development, and especially the impact of violence on the physical, mental, and emotional development of the child. Thank you, Maria Lucia.
And these are very important points, and you already brought us into the thinking on these particular challenges on violence that I think very often we are asked when we say we're working with religious communities and we are working on promoting positive social norms, and we get challenged when we said, yes, and what about violence that takes place in the name of religion? While we always say, for us working with religious communities, that the principles of religion affirm the dignity of the child, as you said, Anand, the practice, the translation of those principles into practice gets challenged, because that moral authority that you mentioned is not sometimes equivalent to how we should treat our children in our communities. So I want to turn now to Sister Grace. And Sister Grace, feel free also to build on Professor Anand's reflection. But from your own religious community, and that's the Catholic Church, how do you see this aspect of the spiritual development, the challenges that you see, but also opportunities within the Catholic Church, which has also a long tradition of supporting families and children? Please go ahead, Sister Grace.
Thank you, Maria Lucia, and thanks to everyone for being here, and thank you too for the invitation extended to our dicastery to be present. Just a little bit about my context. I work at the Dicastery for Interreligious Dialogue, which supports Pope Francis's outreach and dialogue with followers of other religions. And the Catholic Church, as you know, is a global community. So I tried, when thinking about the questions, to really think of principles that Catholics all over the world would share. Some of the examples that I use are probably more from my own experience, which is I grew up in the United States, and I've lived here in Rome for a couple of years now and have been getting to know people from all over the world here. So I did want to begin speaking of the Catholic Christian tradition and the challenges and the opportunities to develop or to support the spiritual development of children by following upon a point of Professor Rambachan, which he just made, which is that religious traditions, they really emphasize the dignity and even, the sacredness of the child, of children. And that's certainly very true in the Christian tradition, that there's a very rich spirituality of childhood. And so much so that it's really encouraged within our tradition to become like children. And I just wanted to offer a brief quote from the Christian scriptures, from the gospel, that really illustrates this very vividly. And this is an occasion on which Jesus was teaching his disciples, his followers. And the gospel says, taking a child, Jesus placed the child among them, and putting his arms around the child, he said to them, whoever receives one child such as this in my name receives me, and whoever receives me receives not me, but the one who sent me. So Jesus is saying, I am a child too, like Jesus, whom we revere as God, is childlike. So we're all called to be that way, to have that openness of children, that trust, that dependence on God ultimately. So from that teaching, there's a very deep reverence for children within the Christian tradition, and actually a sense of learning from children, that adults can learn from children how to live. And that's the opportunity, I think, as we try to support the spiritual development of children, we recognize that it's somewhat of a partnership. It's somewhat of a mutual relationship with children, that they support us adults as we are on our spiritual journey as well. So the challenge that goes with that, I think, is that often we don't live up to that. We want to impose, we want to kind of have a power struggle with children, and we certainly are not always keeping in front of us the dignity of children. But reverence is really the antidote to violence. If we can work harder to live up to this very deep spiritual principle of being childlike, the individual children in front of us will call forth from us that reverence and that respect for them. So I think that's one element from the Christian tradition. And I wanted to highlight just one other element that kind of sprung out to me as I reflected. And that is a reverence for creation that we have in the Christian tradition, and that I know many religions also share. I think this is a huge resource for the spiritual development of children that I feel there's such a need to focus on reconnecting with creation, with nature, with reconnecting with just the roots of our essence as creative beings. And I just wanted to offer another brief quotation, this one from Pope Francis, when he himself was having a meeting with children, and he speaks about this. He said to the children, "Did you notice that creation has no boundaries? Creation has no boundaries. It is for everyone. Plants, forests, animals grow without borders. Creation is an open book that offers a valuable lesson. We are in the world to encounter others, to create communion, because we are all connected. Creation is made to connect us with God and with each other. It is God's social network." So I think that just a little thought, if we can help children and ourselves connect with creation more, we enter a different realm, I think, where barriers can come down, and we can really recognize what is common among all of us as inhabitants on this, our common home. So for now, I think I'll stop there.
Sister Grace, very good reflections in these particular two aspects on to become like children, calling us to become like children, and the reverence for the child, as you call it, the antidote to violence, and this aspect of nature and the interconnectedness of human beings. And I like this God's social network that sounds like a Facebook, God's Facebook, in a way that is this creation that you talk about and our connection to nature. And I think that connects to what Anand was also saying when Anand was saying educating religious leaders on the significance of the early years, which I think are already in our own traditions, religious traditions. So re-examining the importance of the child, how we should see the child in the eyes of God or the divine, or in the highest purpose, in a way, which I think often we forget, and we tend to impose in the child instead of learning from the child. Then we try to make children be like us. Very, very good. So I'm going now to Sheikh Letome from the Islamic tradition. And Sheikh Letome, you are joining us from Kenya. So similarly, from your own tradition, how do you see these challenges and opportunities? And you can build on what the previous speakers have shared. Please go ahead, Sheikh Letome.
Thank you very much, Maria Lucia, and also thank you to Professor Rambachan and Sister Grace. Actually listening to the Hindu perspective, listening to the Catholic perspective, you find a lot of commonalities when we're talking about the spiritual development of children. It's like we are reading from the same script. So this is a connector. Now, speaking from the Islamic tradition, number one, when you talk about spiritual development and its significance for the child, we find that it is indispensable, because it is spiritual development that gives the child a sense of direction, how to relate with its creator, how to relate with themselves, and how to relate with other human beings, whether they belong to their religion, whether they belong to their race or other races. Not only that, how to relate with other creatures of God also. So spiritual development of a child is indispensable. It is important that they get it. And again, from my tradition, children are a gift from God and a trust, meaning we are answerable on how we bring them up. Remember, Today we are here, tomorrow we are not there. We are leaving the world to the children. So what kind of people are we preparing to leave the world to? So according to the Quran, chapter 42, verse 49, to show that children are a gift from God, we are told in the Quran that to God belongs the kingdom of the heavens and the earth. And God creates whatever he wants. And he gifts to whoever he wants. Actually, it begins with females, affirmative action. And he gives to whoever he wants, males, or sometimes he mixes them. Nobody does. I want this mixture, 2, 2, 1, 1. It is God who plans all that. And to some people, they don't get any. So children are a gift from God, and we need to give them spiritual development, which is very good. Whose duty is it to ensure that children get spiritual development? Duty number one goes to the parents. The parents are the immediate people with the responsibility of ensuring that children are given that spiritual development. And that's why for us, when a child is born, the first sound they are supposed to hear is the sound of the prayer. That's why we say a prayer in the ears of the child. In Nairobi, if you're not careful, the first sound the child might hear would be reggae from Bob Marley or something else, some pop music. So we make sure the first sound they hear is the sound of God. Then after that, we say the first school of a child is the parents, and more specifically, the mother. We say the mother is the first school of the child. So parents have that responsibility. The religious leaders also have a responsibility of ensuring that the child has and grows well and has that spiritual development. And they have so many platforms. Religious leaders have so many platforms, including when the mother gives birth, during the naming of the child. All these opportunities, these are all opportunities to ensure that the child has spiritual development, because even the parents rely on the religious leaders to get guidance on how to give spiritual development to the children. So the religious leaders have a duty to the parents to help the parents give their child the correct guidance of spirituality, and also the child themselves. Then the teachers have that responsibility, whether it is in religious schools or in other formal schools. Teachers have a responsibility, even as they nurture the children, give them knowledge in different fields. They have a responsibility of making sure that the children have proper spiritual guidance. And then the society at large, we have a responsibility. What are some of the challenges facing us today? Unfortunately, one of the biggest challenges from where I see it is actually the best thing that has happened to us, technology, the digital revolution. For me, this presents a big, big, big challenge. Like, I want to guide my children in a certain way spiritually, but they are receiving information from so many sources, some of them sometimes conflicting with what I'm teaching them. So misuse of the digital space for me is a very big challenge. The kind of lifestyle we are living, where the mother is working, the father is working, and most of the times the child is left maybe in the care of a caretaker and not the parents. So for me, the kind of lifestyle we are living, it leaves very little time for us to give spiritual guidance to our children. Again, the other challenge is between theory and practice. And Lucia Maria, I think you mentioned it very well. Sister Grace, you also mentioned it very well. When you look at the teachings in theory, they're very good about how to ensure children have proper spiritual development. But when it comes to practice, unfortunately, that is where we have this problem, disconnect. So we need to make sure that whatever is in our scriptures is put into practice. Unfortunately, also, we have seen parents, and maybe I'm a victim of that also, because I feel the child is disrupting me and distracting me from whatever I'm doing. We buy them a lot of gadgets to play with, and without guidance at all. And we don't know what kind of upbringing they're getting from these gadgets. So for me, this is a very big challenge. So through the internet, they're getting a lot of information. Opportunities that we have, of course, we have so many opportunities. And if I talk like a religious leader, we have an opportunity. We are always invited during childbirth. That is an opportunity to make sure the child gets proper religious guidance. We have schools for children. For us, we call them madrasas. And of course, we say the first madrasa is the mother, not the father actually, the mother. But of course, what I preach is that both the father and mother, they are the first school for this child. Then we have the religious spaces. And I keep on telling my fellow religious leaders, I want to disagree with any religious leader who keeps on focusing on going to heaven. We have to live in this world before going to heaven. Unfortunately, many religious leaders are only teaching about how to go to heaven. And for God's sake, God created this world for us. This child will live in this world. Can we also train our religious leaders to focus also on how this child will be a good human being, how they will relate with other people, how they will work hard in their studies, how they will be people who relate with their neighbors in a good way, people who will coexist with others, people who are different from them in a good way. So again, let us use religion as a guide for us, not only for heaven, but in this world before we go to heaven. So we have so many opportunities. Again, the power of religion. And I think Professor mentioned that, Grace mentioned that. I believe the power in religion is so immense if we use it properly. We've seen groups like violent extremist groups, they have misused religion. And you can see the devastating effect of that. We, as the religious leaders, I think we should make proper use of the power we hold as a religion in the right way. Remember, religion is very emotive. To many people, religion is unquestionable. So you can imagine if the information is packaged well, many people will run to the religious leaders and seek for solutions of their problems in religion. So we have all these opportunities. Let me not take a lot of time. I remember the norms you said. It's not about, it's not a normal debate. We need just to dialogue. So thank you very much. Maybe I'll have another opportunity. Thank you, Lucia, Maria Lucia.
Thank you, Sheikh Tommy. Yes, there will be other opportunities, and you took us to several levels, to the environment where the child is brought up, the role of the parents and caregivers, the relationship with the parents and caregivers. But you also mentioned in the beginning that the spirituality of children gives a sense of direction to the child on how to relate to themselves, to others. And that takes us to issues of identity as well, that children are growing up with exclusive identities. And I think that takes us to the topic of violence, which I would like to speak with all the panelists. But before we move into this, I would like to now invite Siobhan to talk more about the role of the spiritual development in the holistic development of children. So we have listened to the religious perspective, telling us exactly that. What's the role in the religious community to develop the child fully, holistically, to support them, the role that parents and caregivers have, how we see it starting from the human dignity of the child. And Siobhan, you come from a more secular perspective. You are a specialist on early childhood. Very often we see that the spiritual development of children is not integrated in early childhood programming. It's not understood when we look at the holistic development of children. How do you see it? How do you see the importance of the spiritual development of children for this holistic well-being?
Thank you, everyone, and good morning, good afternoon, and greetings from Belfast and Northern Ireland. And thank you for the opportunity to represent the Early Childhood Peace Consortium in this very important dialogue. And in thinking about the topic today, I was immediately brought back to the Convention on the Rights of the Child, developed and endorsed in 1989. And indeed, within the convention, the issue of spirituality was given equal recognition to the other domains of child development, the physical, the emotional, the intellectual, the social. And I think, you know, an obvious observation was the interconnectedness of all of these domains so as to support holistic development of children. And within child development, I think very much like our previous speakers have suggested, we understand spirituality as definitely a way of recognizing the dignity and indeed the agency, especially of young children, the ability for children to be connected in the world, to connect with themselves, to develop this sense of identity, but also, very importantly, connections with others, with nature, with God, with the divine, an understanding of what it means for children to be human, to be connected, what it means to have relationships with others, what it means to experience an environment safe and free from violence, what it means to have caring and positive relationships within family, within community, and with educators. And most importantly, I suppose, for the sectors that I represent, the countries that I work with, Northern Ireland in particular, you know, this concept of spirituality is so important in a divided society where it encourages children and adults to respect the other, to respect diversity, to understand where the other is coming from, to have empathy for the other who may be different in terms of religious beliefs, ethnicity, or race. But you've also alluded, Maria-Lucia, to some of the reasons why, you know, even though spirituality was endorsed in the convention, I think, you know, it is obvious that it has been one of the domains that has been seriously neglected up until now. And I suppose, looking at my own context and the context of others, I think there's a fear within the secular organizations of introducing the concept of spirituality, and often this misunderstanding that equates religious development with spirituality, but also, you know, lack of understanding, lack of knowledge about how to work in a very inclusive way with this concept of spirituality, and the importance, I suppose, of providing educators, providing parents, providing key stakeholders with the evidence that brings together the teachings from the religious world with the teachings from child development in terms of appropriate introduction of the concept. And certainly, you know, even against a backdrop where the moral authority of religious teaching in Ireland has been dented, recently there has been more willingness to challenge the very secular curriculum, especially in early childhood, with an intentional introduction of spirituality. And I know we will come to it later, but having resources like the new toolkit to do that and to weave it with other resources that we have in terms of promoting positive and holistic child development, I think is definitely going to be a major resource for us.
Great, thank you so much, Siobhan. very key important aspect, the agency of the child you mentioned, and this connects to what Sister Grace said, that we tend to impose to the child and to make them like us. When the child have rights, they are individuals in their own right. And I think that's an important aspect, how that spiritual development of children can help them develop as they are, who they are meant to be, without imposing our views, which of course is one of the causes of violence against children, the way we see the child. And you touch about being in a divided society, and how important the spiritual development is helpful for children to learn to empathize with this other who is different, which we are going to talk about now when we talk more about violence. And so I want to go now to Dr. Vinia Ariaratne, coming from Sri Lanka, who has had a conflict for many years. And of course, even if the war ended, there are wounds in the society, Dr. Vinia. And so maybe from that perspective, Vinia, how do you see this spiritual development of children critical for the society holistically? You come from a Buddhist background as well. So how do you see what challenges and opportunities in your own community?
Thank you, Maria Lucia, and good evening to all of you. It's a pleasure to be participating in this panel today. So I'm based in Sri Lanka, and I work for the Sarvodaya Shramadana movement, which is a development organization working at grassroots level up to national level, based on Buddhist teachings in holistic development, community development, but we all bring together the traditions of other religions as well, and we are working with all different communities, and all 4 religions, major religions, are also represented in Sri Lanka. So our experience is, of course, spirituality, the concept of having the spiritual dimension integrated into all aspects of development is fundamental to the work that we do. So we see as a development organization, the value of bringing in that dimension in different ways. Of course, as in Buddhism, we very much believe in the interdependency and interconnectedness of individuals, nature, and inanimate things. So it's a approach that is not very alien to our own cultural heritage, and we have been influenced for centuries of this philosophy of holistic development. So we have to look at the current situation as an evolution of the other factors that affect our lives. The social, economic, and political conditions are external sometimes to what we have been practicing, and this because of so many changes that have happened in the world, in our own country, and as Maria Lucia mentioned, referred to, the war that we have had has multiple determinants. So when you look at the role of spirituality and spiritual development in holistic development, whether it is an individual, whether it's a child, whether it's a family or the community, there are multiple dimensions. So in our case, as a development organization, we have recognized, of course, that from the very beginning, many years back, the value of early child development. And it does not start when the child is at the time when the child is born. No, even before that. So we approach the pregnancy, the time of the mother, when the child is still in the womb of the mother. So we have many programs where we try to influence the child's mind, because Buddhist practice is very much about mindfulness, understanding your own self. For that you need a lot of reflection, what we call meditation. So we have introduced meditative practice to all different groups, and particularly to mothers to be with their husbands, the fathers to be together during the pregnancy. They come to our different programs, and the process starts there. And then when the child is born, of course, we now incorporate some of the more recent research findings in child development. You know that the first 1,000 days are very important to physical, nutritional, psychosocial, and cognitive development of the child. And how do you create conditions? So you create conditions not just within the family environment, but also in the community. So when you practice that, then of course you have to recognize what are the threats, external threats to the child for his or her own natural growth. And you try to then work with the community so that you reduce the threats that are coming from outside that would influence negatively on the child. Then you enhance the potential of the child. So you, on one hand, enhance the protective mechanisms, getting the child to understand the surroundings, how to communicate with others, how to understand, how to have empathy. Those values are then nurtured through spiritual development. Then also the threats are also reduced by having social harmony, a collective protective mechanism for children, where the religious institutions also provide support. So whether it is from Sunday schools to the other, mechanisms that are there to bring children together, and also have other, the parents also to participate in certain activities, whether it is nutrition. Now, right now, we are facing a major economic crisis in Sri Lanka. So we run community kitchens, we run food banks. So all these things bring in other spiritual values that we practice in the country as individuals and as communities. We have been practicing these values, and we bring in the concepts of dana or sharing. So that's also very spiritual. Even the people who contribute to these meals every day at a time when we face this food crisis, they are not rich people. So they share whatever they have. So it minimizes the impact on one hand, the nutritional impact. On the other hand, it also brings out the spiritual dimension in a much practical way and in a collective way. So finally, what we do is to really create the opportunities, create spaces also for us to be able to practice the spiritual dimension in a very holistic way. That's how we connect to the child development. And I think that you got an idea of the work that we are doing. Thank you.
Vinya, thank you so much, because I think you mentioned an important aspect of all this is the whole community approach. So yes, we have said that the parents and caregivers have an important responsibility. We have talked about educators also, but we know that children don't grow in isolation. They are part of a community, and you mentioned the importance of the whole community approach. So values get immersed in the approach to children, that our responses, that children learn from early years, the value of empathy, of sharing with others, but also these components and working with the whole community help addressing issues of nutrition, issues of health, or mental health of children and others. So the spiritual aspect of the child is not something that we do separately, but it's integrated with other aspects of child development, which I think is very critical. And the way it is done in Sri Lanka through the Sarvodaya movement, I think is an example for other communities. So I want to move for all the speakers to speak about what we have been mentioning on the issues of violence in several areas. We have talked about direct violence against the child, but we have also talked about the structural issues that affect the child, conflict, even climate change, or issues of fragility in many contexts where we live. And so I'm going to go back to Anand and then go back to this question that there is no space maybe in our scriptures where violence is justified, particularly violence against children. But we know that in practice, the way it happens is that violence is justified, and using scriptures and using the different power in a way that religious leaders have to support and to endorse violence at times is not always the case. And I think that is important to say that it's not always the case, as sometimes we hear violence always happens in religious communities. It's not always the case, but we see that this happens. So how can we address that incongruency between what we preach and what happens, and what religious leaders should maybe do to support parents to ensure that homes are places where children grow up without violence, where children grow up in good conditions to develop fully. So what can be done, Anand? What are these? What do you think this happens? That there is this disparity in a way between what we preach and what we do, and how we can go about it.
Thank you very much, Maria Lucia. You know, this is where the challenge truly lies, and you know, we are all familiar with the statistics, and the statistics are very, very troubling. For example, just to underline the point that you make, 84% of the world's population identifies itself as affiliated with a religion, and 5 of the top 7 most populous countries in the world have above 72% of the population that consider religion as important in their lives. And at the same time, 300 million 2 to 4-year-olds experience violent discipline at the hands of parents or caregivers. So, you know, it's very difficult to wrap one's mind around this predicament that you are underlying. Difficult to comprehend the realities that they describe and what they tell us about ourselves as human beings and our capacity for violence against the most vulnerable and defenseless in our families and communities. So what can we do? Very often, as one person commented in our chat box, Maria Lucia, there are pervasive cultural practices that legitimize and sanction violent methods that are often inconsistent with core religious teachings. But these cultural practices that are present often present themselves or even mask themselves as having religious legitimacy. And I think that what we need is a critical look at the larger cultural practices in those environments where violence against children is very common. And religious leaders must not be hesitant to critique such practices, especially when they betray religious teachings and they seek religious legitimacy. So this is very important. Secondly, Maria Lucia, I think that we do require, there is still too much ambiguity, if I would put it in this way, too much ambiguity still about the necessity of some kind of, you know, violent methods in child rearing. Still some false beliefs that somehow these methods are effective. And we need an unambiguous, multi-religious repudiation of violence in all forms against children. I wish that can happen. Thirdly, I think religious leaders need to be educated on this matter. There is excellent data, empirical data, undeniable data about the ways in which violence, verbal, physical, psychological violence impedes the development of children emotionally, mentally, and of course here we are concerned with spirituality. So we need to bring to the education of our religious leaders what we are learning from the empirical sciences about child development and about the negative effects of violence on children, and especially on brain development. I think we are trying to do this in this project, in this toolkit, but I think here is where this is important. bringing this knowledge, irrefutable evidence to our religious communities. And final point, Maria Lucia, on your excellent question. Sometimes, when we are living within the boundaries and within the walls of our own religious traditions, we don't see ourselves critically. We don't see ourselves clearly. We take our worldviews for granted because our worldviews are not challenged by any alternative perspectives. And sometimes we need the eyes of others, or we need to listen to the voices of others to see ourselves clearly and to understand better how sometimes our own practices, our own beliefs are detrimental to the well-being of others and to children. And this is why I want to end by saying that wherever possible, I have spoken about bringing together the insights of empirical sciences, child development to the religious communities. But I also want to make a plea that in addressing this problem, wherever possible, our approach should be interreligious. I think we will strengthen whatever we do by uniting our voices, and also, as I said, by learning from each other. Let us hear what other traditions are doing, what they are thinking, how they are approaching these problems, how far ahead they are in thinking about child development and the role of religion. So let us learn from each other. I think this would be wonderful. But let me just end by saying, let us have an unambiguous repudiation of violence in all forms from our religious communities. Thank you very much, Maria Lucia.
Excellent, Anant. I think this is a very important call for action that is interfaith and is also evidence-based using science. And I think one important aspect is that very often we see that a lot of work is done from the religious communities. And when we try to work with other sectors, it becomes very difficult. But you are asking that we need to see the evidence. There is evidence on the impact of violence, on the importance of brain development in the early years. There is evidence on the role that parents and caregivers play. There is evidence on the importance also of the spiritual development of children. So how do we use that evidence to educate also society, religious leaders on one side to challenge these cultural norms that condone violence against children, social norms, but also to understand across the board when we have worked with religious communities, we have seen what you have said, Anand. We have seen that religious leaders didn't know the impact of violence on early childhood. They were very surprised when we tell them this is what the evidence tells. They are very surprised to hear that it has an impact on the brain, that it has an impact when children grow up. And at times, very often, what we all call violence, like corporal punishment, is even perceived as non-violence for children. So I think there is so much need to have dialogue with religious leaders on this topic, but also with other sectors. So I'm going to Sister Grace on this. Sister Grace, also feel free to bring up maybe issues of structural violence as well, if this is something that you'd like to speak about particularly. We heard from Siobhan, we heard from Sheikh Letomi on issues in societies, divided societies, how we see the other, how children learn from early years, how to see the other. And so what is your take, Sister Grace, how we can work to address this incompatibility of our religious principle beliefs and the magnitude of violence against children?
Thank you. Well, I think my first basic thought is, adults need nurturing just as much as children need nurturing. And I think that's one of the strengths of the toolkit of the consortium, the toolkit for spiritual development. It takes that very seriously, that adults need to be formed in knowing how to further these principles of nonviolence and these principles of spirituality. So I think that the formation, the nurturing of adults and of children, maybe it's too obvious, but goes hand in hand, and you really can't do one without the other. So the support of families, I think, you know, families encounter a lot of difficulty and stress often when they have children. And I know there are cultural differences in that, and some societies there's more networks and support systems for like young couples maybe. But I know that in many contexts and many societies that are kind of secularizing, you know, people are very isolated. And I think we see that more and more. They're cut off from any kind of, in particular, any kind of spiritual support. So if they're not, if they don't have that support of what is the meaning of this, of having a family, what are we doing? You know, the reality of it can be harsh at times, and the demands of having children. The joy is there, yes, but then how do you live day to day with the demands of raising children? So I think just from my own experience and things that might help that are the promotion of I guess a different way of life in general, a life that is more focused on relationships, and if faith communities can help build these types of you know, ways of life, not so focused on consumption or money or you know, having things, but a life that's more kind of sober and simple and focused on the family and the wider relationships, that there's less stress involved in that path of life. In a way, if your priorities are different, and focused on building relationships within the family, your children probably, you know, you might spend more time with your children. I know that many families are struggling to just be with their children. Like someone was mentioning, you know, the kids just have the devices, and that's kind of their interaction, which is not really face to face. It's not bodily, which is so important for development. So I think, you know, and I have heard of many small faith communities beginning programs of small groups, where families have a small group that they go to with their difficulties of raising children, or their marital difficulties, you know, a small group that they can trust. So I think if faith communities, religious leaders can work on developing opportunities for people to have real relationships, so not everything is online, you know, but to develop trust relationships. You know, adults desperately need that as they try to really raise their children. Also, a focus on spiritual mentorship, you know, is very life-giving for people, I think, and for people to have, you know, a one-on-one relationship where they can talk about some of their difficulties, so that it doesn't get taken out, or it doesn't in violent ways get taken out on children often. And then I'll go back to my favorite, you know, encounters with creation and nature create a slower life, one that is more beautiful. And I know not everyone has equal opportunities to experience that, but anything faith communities can do to bring people into that sense of rootedness in the world by contact with creation, I think reduces the risk of violence in our lives.
Thank you so much, Sister Grace, particularly on the point that adults need nurturing, and all the different tools and ideas that you provide here on the spiritual mentorship, creating spaces. So trust is built in the family as well. Also the stressors that family are exposed to, and that transmit to the child, because children grow up also in many contexts with toxic stress that affect their development. And the possibility to spend more time with children. I think all these are very important aspects that religious communities can work with. Sheikh Letome, what would be your recommendations and your thoughts about this?
Yeah, thank you very much, Maria Lucia. I've been listening to my colleague panelists. And let me say this from the onset. Violence against anybody is enough. Violence against children is even worse. Violence in the name of religion, for me, is at the peak of inhumanity and also ungodliness. Because for me, and I'm talking from personal experience, some types of violence meted out on children in the name of religion are so worrying and so disturbing and very difficult to deal with them because of the nature of religion. Because the moment a person believes whatever I'm doing is sanctioned by my religion, you can come up with the laws and say it is illegal. They will tell me I am answering to a higher law, the divine law. You come up with a medical approach, it is harmful to the health of the child. They'll tell you God is happy with me in this. So for me, this is the worst kind of violence to deal with. And I'm going to give an example. In my community, I've been dealing with this, and I'm happy Arigato is helping us, especially after the Panama Declaration and violence against children, female genital mutilation. A form of violence against children, because in the community that I'm working with, 100% Muslims, it is practiced on children as young as 6 years. Actually, we have discovered near the border from where I am now, children as young as 3 months, and these are girls, where they have their genitalia mutilated in the name of religion. Violence that is celebrated. And the government of Kenya, of course, has come up with interventions. Intervention number 1, legal. So we have laws against female genital mutilation. But is it working? No. It is not done openly. It is done quietly. It is done to a person who has no voice to go and prosecute and say, I am being mutilated, a child. And the very people who are supposed to protect the child are the perpetrators. So they go scot-free. The legal approach has failed to work. Medics also came up with their approach. It is harmful to the health of the child. And the answer they got, for those who believe that this is a religious practice, God is happy with us doing this. And sometimes even when the child bleeds and dies out of overbleeding, they say it is the will of God. I don't know which God this is. So I'm trying to emphasize here violence in the name of religion. The other form of violence in the name of religion is forced and early marriage. Young children being forced into marriage, and people quote religious scriptures, rather misquote religious scriptures. So it becomes very difficult. So how have we been dealing with this kind of violence in the name of religion? Violence that is celebrated by, number 1, going to the religious teachings and reasoning with the gatekeepers. Religious leaders are considered as I consider them as the gatekeepers in their communities, because everybody refers to them. They say Imam so-and-so has said this, the Sheikh has said this, so we have to follow. So our first approach was to the gatekeepers of the society. Reason with them, look at the scriptures, and also look at the creation of God. And did God intend that parts of the body be mutilated so that he'll be happy? We believe God created the human being in the best form, and every organ has a purpose. And we have to respect that. So religious leaders convince them and also show them that they have been misreading the scriptures. They have been misinterpreting the religion. And the biggest problem again is, on one hand, we have the culture. Each one of us has a cultural baggage that we carry. And then we have religion on the other side. And sometimes it is very difficult to draw a line between what is cultural and what is religious. And for us, we convince the religious leaders that these are harmful cultural practices. So for me, this is a big problem. The other kind of violence that is practiced in the name of religion, I don't know where this came from. Some people believe, and I'm talking about my community, that religious education can only be imparted through violence. So you find in the Quran schools, and we in GNRC and Arigato here, we are working on this, that madrasa teachers who teach the Quran, they believe that unless the child is beaten, the child cannot cram the Quran. And their argument, listen to this argument, and I hope there are Muslims listening to this. They say, when the archangel Jibril first came to Prophet Muhammad to bring down the revelation, he squeezed Muhammad, and that's how he was able to understand the Quran. So the child has to be squeezed using the cane for them to understand the Quran. My argument is this: the Quran teacher is not Angel Gabriel, and my child is not Prophet Muhammad. And Prophet Muhammad himself taught that teach religion in a loving manner, not in a violent way. I have a Christian background. I know that even Jesus Christ said, let the children come to me. He was loving to the children. Prophet Muhammad once was seen kissing a child, one of his grandchildren. And then one of his companions said, I have 10 children. I've never kissed any one of them. And he said, what do I do to you if God has removed from your heart sympathy and compassion for the children? So we find that the role models we are supposed to follow, like Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and Prophet Jesus Christ, peace be upon him, they showed love to the children. They taught the children religion in a loving way. So we need to re-educate our religious teachers that they should. I grew up hating the Quran, and on Saturday when I'm supposed to go to the madrasa, I would even pray to fall sick because I don't want to meet the madrasa teacher on Saturday and Sunday, because for me, he represented cruelty, you know? So we need to re-educate our religious teachers. Let the children love the religious teachings. Teach them in a nice way, in a kind way. And this also has contributed to violence in the children when they grow up, because violence begets violence. Again, when children grow up in an environment where they see a lot of violence, domestic violence, I mean, psychologically, that is violence against the children, and we are also training them to be violent. So I think religious leaders have, the solution for me is this: can we go back and reread and interpret the religious teachings properly with one thing in mind in terms of children? What is in the best interest of the children? How did God intend us to bring up these children? Because in all the scriptures, I want to say, there is no space for violence, not only to children, but even to animals. Religions that teach that don't be violent to children, to animals. How would the same religion support violence against children? So we need to be educated. Maria Lucia, the gatekeepers of communities are the religious leaders. We need to re-educate them with all due respect. Thank you.
Sheikh Letome, I think you could have said it better with examples and concrete recommendations on the importance of challenging those social norms by educating religious leaders, and I think also religious leaders like you, like I mean, I don't like calling them champions, but in a way, those voices, in a way, prophetic voices that challenge those understandings that are in the community, that are speaking and that others can follow, and that you can say, this is not how it should be interpreted from the scripture. I see a lot of comments in the chat, and very good reflections speaking about what we are discussing. So I encourage the panelists to read through the questions, because we will move to those in a few minutes. But I'm going to Siobhan and to Vinia on the more practical maybe perspective, looking at the spiritual development as a mechanism to protect children from violence. How can this happen? How it can become part of a measure to protect children from violence. For both of you, and also in your response, if you can look also, how can we ensure that the spiritual development, if it is such a powerful element for the protect children from violence, how can it be better integrated in child development? So Siobhan and then Vinia, please.
Thank you. And just to build on, what has already been said, I think it's so important that we do use the evidence from science, especially the evidence on the developing brain, the importance of positive relationships, positive discipline as opposed to harsh discipline. But, again, I would also stress how important it is to use the international instruments that support the prevention of violence, the protection of children, and the participation. Again, the importance of this, the agency of the child, but the participation and the visibility of children, and to use international and national laws to support enabling policies that will allow the end, for example, of physical violence. We have used campaigns here in Ireland to promote both positive discipline, positive parenting, the nurturing framework, the end of violence in the home. We've already been able to do that in terms of campaigns against the end of violence in institutions. And also supporting this dialogue with all actors between faith communities and the secular communities. I've been struck recently in how we live our lives in separate channels, and often the two don't meet, and there isn't this sharing of knowledge from the spiritual world and the secular world, especially in terms of challenging some of the stereotypical traditional approaches to raising children in Ireland. And I've heard it from our discourse, it's common across the world. Spur the rod, spoil the child. Children should be seen, not heard. There are opportunities for us to really challenge those traditional approaches, but present positive, enabling alternative approaches. And one of the things that has enabled us to do that as well has been to challenge what traditionally was a culture of silence around child rearing practices, and enable people to look for help in terms of alternative approaches, provide the support, create those engagements and connections within communities so that parents aren't feeling isolated without the support, without the knowledge, without the skills and expertise. Develop better communication strategies about the resources that are available to support parents, to support educators, that could support religious leaders in terms of developing an alternative approach to harsh discipline. And also, I think there's an opportunity to reform many of the institutional approaches within early education training environments to incorporate this connection between spirituality and positive child rearing and child discipline practices.
Thank you so much, Joanne. Czech economy also referred to laws, talking about policies, challenging this culture of silence and alternative approaches. I think very often what we see is that people don't know what's the alternative. Religious leaders don't know what's the alternative and how it works. And so I think these are very important, develop communication strategies as well. I'm moving to Vinia. Vinia, the same questions from your own context and perspective, also as a medical doctor.
Yeah, so I think it's very contextual. Now, for example, at the moment, just after we were recovering from the COVID-19, pandemic and the impact, the social and economic impact in our society. Now we have been facing this economic crisis for more than a year. So we have seen a range of mental health issues in general, and also violence against children have also increased very much. So I think we need to look at, of course, there are factors which lead to violence against children under normal circumstances. We know, and a lot of studies have been done, what are the determinants that lead to violence against children. But at the same time, when there are additional pressures coming in, and even the parents are, under a lot of stress because they can't even meet the basic needs of children. And then in a situation like that, how you can't just, just put the onus or the blame on the parents themselves, or even for that matter in schools. The corporal punishment has become a major problem, where we had made some progress through what Siobhan has also referred to earlier, having legislations. Now it's illegal to have any form of physical punishment in schools. It's not just physical, verbal or emotional or any form of, but it's still happening. And there is also like justification, strong justification saying that now, at this time we need this because things are getting out of hand like that. So I think we need to, on one hand, really have an understanding of what are the specific causes, what are the factors that lead to, and then start addressing them. It may be education, it may be legislation, it may also be looking at some of the positive cultural things to sensitize. Now, for example, I will give you as a medical, from a medical perspective, lullabies, right? Lullabies, the songs that you sing to put children to sleep. Now, in our culture, there's kind of literature on that, like they are very deep and very strong messages are given. So even though the child is still very young, maybe months old or 2 years old, but the older children also listen to the mother singing lullabies to their children, and then to the younger children and infants, and it gets registered in the mind. And if you analyze, now we have our organization, Sarvodaya, has compiled a book of lullabies. It covers good habits, good hygiene, good health, environment, threats, physical threats to child well-being. I mean, it's a vast and also influenced by religious traditions, religious teachings, the doctrine, and religious principles are also very much integrated into lullabies, right? So we are now reminding, because most of the mothers now, because of they going to work, and it's not the traditional grandmother mother kind of relationship that we have with our children now. So we have to remind. So that is one. And so we have to look at some innovative ways how we can create that consciousness. Then using also social media and also creating public opinion. Now we have several groups who are working very hard, which are giving very specific messages on educating those people who think that you have to use a little bit of violence, little bit of force on children to discipline them, to put them into correct path and that kind of. But we challenge with scientific facts. So you can use social media as well. So I think we need to have a multi-pronged approach. You have to attack this from multiple fronts, using multiple tools. starting with, spiritual tools where, as I said, there are certain cultural practices which are very positive, which reinforces the personality of the child from the very beginning. Then as certain things that can be very much a deterrent from possible perpetrators, preying on children, to legislations, then to creating a mass consciousness, mass awareness using the social media and the mainstream media.
Thank you, Vinia, because again, you remind us of the importance of working with the entire community approach. It's not just one approach. It's not just working with the faith leaders. It's not just educating the faith leaders. There is legislation, as all of you have mentioned. There is the role of social media, of this. There are cultural norms and messages that surround our society, parents and caregivers. So how do we challenge those messages that tend to take away these more spiritual messages and at the same time take the approach of nurturing from the early years the child, and at times parents leave the nurturing of the child to the school, to the social media. You talk about children all the time on TV or watching videos and things, and then we kind of give that possibility to nurture the child from the early years to others, to the social media, to television, to other messages, and you talk about that and how then we work together with the different spheres of society and look for more innovative ways. There are several questions here on the chat. I think some of them have been responded by you, but I'm gonna read some of them, and I'm gonna then go back to the speakers to respond to those that you feel more encouraged to respond. But there are some related to the issues of violence, and one is in the daily life of many religions is the unfair treatment of girls. This is seen as normal, but I think it's also sort of violence against girls. How do you address this issue in your faith communities? And Sheikh Letomi talk about female genital mutilation and how through your work also you have been challenging that. So there is a response to that, but we can also look through other traditions. Then Selena has been giving us many reflections here as well about how we reassess our own religious traditions. And she talks about the challenges and the different types of violence that are in our religious traditions, but also in terms of the religious texts. And she said many sacred texts which are embedded in ancient cultures, including my own, do contain literal stories of violence against children or harmful practices against them. This can be reinterpreted differently, of course, but not enough. Sustained work has been really done in detail in this area. And she said the average ordinary religious leader is not being equipped to deconstruct this in their training, and many religious people still endorse some harmful practices. So I think there is her reflections, I think, is, and others have said here, sometimes religious leaders think that they are knowledgeable enough and they don't need to be trained. So how are they addressed? Then there are other questions here. The difference between religion and spirituality, that these are two different things. What is the mechanism we have to prevent violence and abuse children faced from the clergy, as well as religious institutions and places of worship? Normally it is hush-ups or the victims are blamed for it. And then there are other questions regarding, do we already have the number of religion around our sphere of intervention and the associated violence against children? I think maybe how do we reach out to religious communities? And then other questions regarding how to train the religious leaders. The majority of them are already knowledgeable enough. And then a question on Facebook, how can we reach more religious leaders and communities and help them learn about child spiritual development as a mechanism to protect children from violence? So also it's around this dialogue we have had. So Sister Grace, Anand, Sheikh Letomi, Shoban, Vinia, feel free to build on these questions with some of your answers, but maybe some final reflections. as we move to the last 15 minutes, and then maybe just to the participants. Our panelists have been referring to the toolkit, and maybe some of you don't know, we'll be introducing the toolkit that this consortium has launched in the last 10, 12 minutes of this panel discussion. So who would like to start with some reflections?
I could be very
Sister
quick.
Grace, and then Sister Grace and Sheikh Letome. Please,
Yeah,
Sister Grace.
I'll be excusing myself shortly because I'm in another meeting, but allow me just to say something.
Yes.
Yes, there is a question that was asked on the chat. How do you educate religious leaders? They are already educated. So even where do you begin? And this is a challenge that I faced. And I've attempted to put an answer in the chat. But let me say this in short. Remember, the religious leaders are a product of the community. They also carry the baggage, the cultural baggage. They come with it there. Some of these religious leaders are a product of the same violent system. We need to break that cycle. Let me talk from practical experience. I work within the Somali community of northeastern Kenya and Somalia, and that is where I am right now. I am in the heart of Somaliland in Kenya. The Somalis practice the worst type of female genital mutilation, type 3, where they do not only mutilate, but they infibulate the girls. They scar them forever. They even ruin their matrimonial life, but they believed it is sanctioned by religion. I come in myself, a religious leader and also a lawyer, and some of the religious leaders are more knowledgeable than me. They have been reading the Quran for all these years, but they have been supporting the practice. Now, I'll use the same Quran that they use, the same teachings of the Prophet they use, that they're even better than me. But because of the cultural baggage that they carry, they belong to the same community, they are blinded by their culture. Again, they do not want to oppose their communities. So I do not come to teach them religion. I just come to sensitize them and awaken them. Please, can you distinguish between what is your culture and what is your religion? Again, many religious institutions that produce these scholars, I know in Christianity it might be different, but for us Muslims, they are product of madrasas. They were subjected to that cruel way of teaching. They know better, they do not know any better. So we retrain them on child psychology, understanding the children. They need to understand the children. We also educate them on the laws of the country. As a lawyer also, I train them that the laws of the country say this, it is illegal to do this. And I'll tell you, these laws are not in conflict with our religion. Actually, we should support. And the medical approach is not against our religion. It is in conformity with our religion. So we do not educate them on the contents, religious contents. They have more than we have, but we sensitize them so that they can move away from the cultural baggage. And that's why in Kenya, the champions against female genital mutilation, within the religious circles, they are religious leaders who do not come from those communities. We are winning over religious leaders from the communities that practice, and because their people have to listen to them, these are the people we are dialoguing with, reasoning with, and I want to thank God that they're listening to us. So whoever said, how do you train religious teachers? That is the answer that I have. Dialogue with them so that they can move away from their culture. Thank you. And I'll be begging to leave after this because I am in another meeting with Arigato here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sheikh Letome. Excellent reflections. And I think that differentiation, religious beliefs, norms with cultural norms that permeate the religious beliefs is very important. So thanks for this reflection, Sheikh Letome. Sister Grace, please go ahead.
Sure. So actually, my brief comments kind of follow upon what Sheikh Latome just shared when he was talking about dialogue. I think that it's important for us who are passionate about these topics when we engage in them in our faith communities or anywhere, to keep that spirit of peace within ourselves as we are, in a sense, fighting for the rights of children, you know, fighting for this awareness that needs to come to do that with peace and respect for all people, and to approach religious leaders with peace and a sense of dialogue and a sense of they're doing the best they can, and they are struggling with the same issues that all of us are struggling with, being human beings. So I also just wanted to acknowledge that many people in the chat are bringing up a really important issue, which is that of awareness and speaking about these issues. And, you know, really that's the first step to stop the silence around what's happening. So I think, you know, that's in the Catholic Church an ongoing process that we're always trying to work at. And I know that especially recently, Pope Francis and other leaders within the church have been speaking about violence against particularly girls and women. And so it's just always, we always have to just stay aware, just keep working at it, and keeping it in the forefront. I had one more point, but it's escaping me now. But maybe
it comes back. Very good point. Speaking up and stopping this awareness. Very good points, Sister Grace. Anand, Siobhan, Vinia, who'd like to? Anand, please.
Thank you, Maria Lucia, and thank you, Sister Grace and Sheikh Ibrahim. I want to just say how much I appreciate the spirit of Sheikh Ibrahim's contribution and his readiness to be self-critical and to look with deep honesty at what is happening within his own community and to speak about these. I think this is a model for all of us. And if we had to have hope in transforming positively our religious traditions to work on behalf of children, we need the kind of leadership that Sheikh Ibrahim exemplifies. So thank you very much, Sheikh. Maria Lucia, just by way of, as we are coming to an end, I think that there is an interesting consensus that has been emerging in our dialogue. And if you just permit me very briefly to lift up some of those points, I mean, I'm sure others might add. So in spite of all of the difficulties that we have identified, including, you know, the kinds of issues that the Sheikh has raised, I think we all agree that religious traditions, religious communities, religious leadership have a vital role to play in nurturing spirituality in children for the prevention of violence. I would say even that these communities are indispensable because of, you know, the moral authority, outreach, convening power, and everything else. Secondly, I think that we have mentioned, and people in the chat have mentioned this point, and it's come up in various ways, that when we think about violence against children, we cannot do so in isolation from the larger structural realities within which we live. So just to give one example of what I mean, Maria Lucia, I think it is Siobhan had highlighted for us the special challenges of the girl child and girl children. So there is violence, and of course, the girl child in so many different cultures is a particular recipient of this kind of violence. But this is a larger structural issue, the structural issue of patriarchy in so many of our communities. So we can't address, you know, this problem only at a micro level, but we have to also look at the macro structures that perpetuate these problems. So I hope that we could give attention to that. Thirdly, I think we have all agreed, we have all spoken about it in different ways, about the necessity for education of religious leaders on the problem of child violence and on the positive ways to promote the flourishing of children. We need an education program, and we have to find ways to engage them on this new wisdom, as so many of us identify, this new wisdom that we are learning about child development, brain development, the negative effects of violence from psychology, from neuroscience, and so on. That knowledge has to be transmitted to religious leaders and through religious leaders to communities. So sharing of knowledge is something I think we've all spoken in different ways about. I think also I heard on comments and from my colleagues here, the need for partnerships, that this requires a concerted effort that is not the sole and exclusive preserve of religious communities, but of state actors, non-government organizations. If the well-being of children cannot bring us together, Maria Lucia, what will bring us together? We have so many sacred teachings that summon us to care for and to love and to nurture children. So we need these partnerships. I think that we speak about also the negative effects of technology and exposure to technology, but I think technology and media also offer us wonderful opportunities. We're speaking about challenges and opportunities. I saw recently here in the United States, for the first time I saw it, and it really got my attention. I don't know if any of my colleagues from the United States have seen it, but there's an ad now running on TV about child violence, and where you hear the screams of a child who is being punished in a school. The use of corporal punishment in schools is still a significant issue here in the United States. And that is a powerful ad. So how can we use the media in constructive and strategic ways to publicize what we all of us here are committed to? How can we do this to create public awareness and to educate? I think this will get us far. Will be good progress for us as a way of sharing and disseminating information. And finally, there is something positive also about which we have all spoken. Our concern is not merely the prevention of violence against children. That is surely what we are concerned about, but to build communities of love and justice, freedom from fear, and flourishing. So child violence has to be resisted, but our goal is a very positive one, is to promote the flourishing and happiness and well-being of the child and their communities. So I think we must not ignore the articulation of this goal. So it is not simply combating, but also building, celebrating. It's a joyful, our vision is a joyful one. And I think we are aware of it. We often don't articulate it enough, but I think we should articulate it and lift it up as what our ultimate objective is. Thank you, Maria Lucia. I don't get a chance. Thank you so much for your own role in bringing us together for this important and beautiful dialogue and for the great work. I hope you will speak about the toolkit, and it's an amazing resource that has been developed.
Thank you, Anand, for this kind of summary, which I think gives way to Siobhan and Vinia to give their final remarks.
Thank you, Maria Lucia. Just a couple of final points, and I suppose, you know, we in Ireland are on a journey of recovery after a period of time when the horrors of both institutional and family abuse have been, you know, really to the fore. And some of the lessons that we've learned is to listen to children, first of all, and to believe their message and to believe in children. And the importance of developing strong safeguarding policies that will protect children, but protect everybody within the process. Use accountability mechanisms, and often that has meant using the courts to show, you know, a public punishment for adults who have abused children, whether in the home or institutional setting. The importance of education, re-education, continuing education, and intersectoral dialogue. And especially that point of using the media in a very positive way. We have run a campaign over the last 20 years of using media messages to promote respect for children and respect for each other. And I think building a culture of respect, valuing the rights of children and families will create the transformation that we all desire.
Thank you, Siobhan. Vinia, please, your final remarks.
I think I have very little to add. I think Ananthan has really summarized well. It's just one point that he emphasized also, trusted relationships. You know, now, if you look at in my country, the child abuse cases, particularly sexual abuse, 90% of the perpetrator has been somebody who the child has trusted and who is known to the child. This is the sad side of the story. So I think even though we think that they are trusted relationships, they are not trusted relationships. So how to build real trust where the child is protected? I think that's a huge challenge. So we need to work on that as well, and then educate and also strengthen children for them to be able to also protect themselves, to really reducing the threat to the children so that they are not abused, by doing all the other interventions that we can do, from structural interventions to legal interventions to spiritual interventions to educational interventions to information, media, all that. Thank you.
Thank you, Vinia, and all the speakers, Sheikh Tommy, who already left, Anand, Sister Grace, Siobhan, Vinia, for this wonderful dialogue. I think many positive things have been said, also very challenging things, but also opportunities and ideas to work together and work forward in enhancing the spiritual development of children, but also working together to create the conditions for the spiritual development of children to take place. And I will also, in the positive line, as Anand was saying, I would also like, while my colleagues upload the presentation of the toolkit, I just want to say that, I mean, here we have, of course, talk about all the challenges in terms of violence, but and that very often they are condoned by religious communities and so on. Sheikh Tommy made the differentiation also that there are cultural norms that permeate those religious beliefs, and I think that's important to differentiate. But I also want to highlight that it is when we are nurtured within religious context as well, where the child is respected, where we can speak up, where we are free, where we learn from the adults, we're sharing, that spirituality is so naturally developed. And I think all of us that have grown up with contact with religious communities can be witness of that, on these positive aspects, on what brings to us this reverence for the life of others, this empathy for others, those things that cannot be taken for granted, because in a busy world and day-to-day life that parents have, religious communities play a very significant role in creating those spaces for those values to emerge, and for this connectedness with one another to be nurtured. So, and I also want to say that even if we are referring to spiritual communities, in communities where maybe children do not grow up within a religious community, but where those values are lived, where those values are exemplified, and this is affirmed, and the human dignity of the child is affirmed, we see the spiritual development of children emerging much faster than in contexts where children are exposed to discrimination, to harsh practices, to discrimination of the other, and so on. So I think I want to finish with that note, and then share very quickly. My colleagues can, Beth, if you can upload the presentation. So we have been talking about a toolkit. The panelists, most of the panelists have been part of a consortium, that is the Consortium Nurturing Values and Spirituality in Early Childhood. Last year, we launched this toolkit called Nurturing the Spiritual Development of Children in the Early Years, a contribution to the protection of children from violence and for the promotion of their holistic well-being. And precisely on this that Anand was saying, it's not just to protect children from violence, but how we ensure that children flourish. And if you go to the next slide, so this was a 4-year collaboration where we looked at the evidence, the research. These are the organizations that are part of this consortium, the evidence, the research, the practices. We looked at good practices in different communities, faith-based organizations, but also other organizations that are working on early childhood. We work with the Global Partnership to End Violence Against Children, with the Office of Disarrest on Violence Against Children, and many other colleagues with inputs from UNICEF, inputs from the World Bank, and others. And we developed this toolkit. If you go to the next slide, Beth, if you go to the next slide, that aims to help equip faith actors, which I think responds to what we have been saying, that religious leaders are there, they need to be equipped to engage actively in the protection of children from violence in early childhood and the promotion of their holistic well-being, so that they can support parents, caregivers, educators, and Anand referred to this, 84% of the population in the world adhere to a particular religious belief. Religious leaders are important influencers for communities, and we know, and Anand referred to that also, they are important educators for families and communities, so that they can they can influence parents, caregivers, communities to take an active role in addressing violence in early childhood, but also nurturing the spiritual development of children. We go next. There are 3 objectives of this toolkit: is to create the spaces and opportunities for those faith actors, but also for parents, caregivers, and educators to reflect on the importance of the spiritual development of children and identify the benefits it has for the children's holistic well-being. Second is to encourage self-examination, and I think we talk a lot about this here. We need self-examination of our own religious and spiritual principles, teachings, and practices that affirm the dignity of the child, the positive norms, but also those that condone violence against children. And third, that this toolkit provides tools, which I think are very important. We cannot just discuss and have dialogues, and we need tools for parents and caregivers, for faith actors, to build caregiving practices and skills for nurturing the spiritual development of children. So we go to the next slide, and I'm going to be quickly, as we only have 5 minutes. This toolkit has been developed for organizations that are working directly with faith actors, religious and spiritual communities, but also that are working directly with parents, caregivers, and educators, and are interested in the spiritual development of children. It can be organizations that are not religious, but are interested in this spiritual aspect of the child, but also faith actors that are working directly with parents and caregivers. So we go next. As mentioned, the toolkit addresses the importance of the spiritual development. It makes the linkage between the spiritual development and the protection of children from violence. It presents research on the impact of violence against children and describes the how we can nurture the spiritual development of children, what are the conditions that are necessary to nurture the spiritual development of children, how we can work together, how this can be integrated in the organization's programs, early childhood programs, parenting programs, and others, and how training can happen. So if you go next, Beth. And it's built on three premises, and Sister Grace referred to that, that each adult, the first one, each adult involved in this supporting the spiritual development of children, either as a facilitator, parent, caregiver, educator, needs to be equipped and to understand and internalize why spiritual development is critical for children's holistic well-being, how it contributes to the protection of children from violence. So this is not internalized, it's very difficult to go and train others and to do it with children, of course. And that refers to the second premise, which is that we as adults need to nurture our own spiritual development. And Sister Grace talked about spiritual mentoring as well. So we live very busy lives. So how we are nurturing and in contact with our own spirituality so that it can be transmitted to our children. Children learn by example. So how we create these conditions and we transmit to the child. The third premise is that children's spiritual capacities are fostered and flourish by promoting positive and nurturing relations with caregivers. We talk about trusted relationships, and Vinia talk about this, saying that children trust these adults are closest to them, but those that are closest to them are the ones that exercise violence against children. We need to create safe, respectful, violence-free environments. Cheikle Tommy referred about those environments as well. And we need to create empowering experiences for children. And Siobhan talked about that when she spoke about the agency of the child. So how the child develop prosocial behaviors, nurture ethical values, they learn to relate to others, to practice those values in environments that are free for them to explore, to play, to relate to others, when they are not conditioned on to whom to talk or not to talk, not talk to this group of people or these people from the other communities, but they develop this sense of purpose, this sense of belonging, this sense of interconnectedness with one another. So these are the three premises, and if you go next, Beth. My colleague will be putting now the link on the chat for people who are interested on this toolkit so that they can download it. So the toolkit has different booklets. It's a box that contains several booklets and a flip book at the end for parents and caregivers. So briefly, I'm gonna walk you through these booklets if you go next. So the first booklet is a conceptual framework, and it's very much what our panelists have been talking about today. It's about the dignity of the child, how the spiritual development of children is part of the rights of the child rights approach, the holistic development of the child, the whole community approach that Vinia spoke about and that Siobhan also emphasized, the nurturing care framework which has been developed, and Vinia talked about the first 1,000 days of life of the child as critical importance. There is a framework that has been developed by WHO, by UNICEF and others on how to create the conditions to nurture the child in the early years. That is the importance of early childhood development, and we have talked about this, the foundation of the lifelong capacities, the critical importance in our religious traditions. Cheikle Tommy referred to this also when he spoke about, what we say to the child when they are born, how the environment they grow up. Spirituality in children, so the understanding of spirituality, why it is central to holistic development, and the innate capacity of the child for spirituality. And last is violence in early childhood. We look at direct and structural violence, the impact on their well-being, but also the ethical demand to challenge violence against children. If you go next. if you give me a few minutes more, 3-4 minutes, so that I'm not going to go through this. Anand referred to this several times. Sister Grace as well, about the affirmation, the human dignity of the child, and the sanctity, the sacredness of the child. This is central to this toolkit. And this is a central element, not just for religious traditions, but also in the principles of human rights and the Convention, the Rights of the Child. If we go next. Article 27, among many other articles of the Convention, speak about the importance of the right of the child to the holistic well-being, including the spiritual development of the child. We go next. And then the importance of the holistic well-being. And in this toolkit, we see the spiritual development is central. It supports the other domains of development of the child. So it can be conceived as yet another element. But what we have seen is the spiritual, the child, it connects with the other elements that are part of the holistic well-being of children. We go next. The importance of the early years, and Anand talk about the brain, and we know, and Siobhan talk about this, the early years are critical for the child development. It's in the early years where children develop their lifelong capacities, their health, where children develop their capacity to relate to others. And we know that what happens in the early years has repercussions for the years to come. So the environment, the possibilities for children to grow in an environment of care, free of violence, where they are nurtured in non-violent environments, are critical for them to learn to explore the world, to relate to others, to learn and to develop cognitive skills, also social emotional skills, and their spiritual well-being. So we go next. This is what our colleague had been talking about, the importance of early childhood in our religious traditions. So if we go next, and if we go next, I'm gonna just walk you through the different booklets. And next, Anand referred to the magnitude of violence. And if we go next, this is the ethical demand. We talk about these three conditions, and the panelists talk about these conditions in different ways. We said that to nurture the spiritual development of children, it is necessary that children grow in safe, respectful, and violence-free environments. And Siobhan and Vinia talk about this holistic approach. So it is not enough that that children are safe in the family, in the community, in the schools, in the religious places. That should be a whole community approach. The positive relationships that are built between the parent, the caregiver, and the child, and the empowering experiences that children go through to develop their agency, their sense of belonging, their sense of interconnectedness with others. And so the toolkit is built on these three particular elements. And if we go next, there is a learning program that has been developed to train the faith actors, parents, and caregivers around these three particular areas. Module 1 is important for children's spiritual development, and is the conceptual framework with the different aspects, nurturing one's own spirituality. And the third is the module where we look at the three conditions, and then with practical activities and how it can be done. So we move from the conceptual framework to how we nurture ourselves, and then how we do it through these conditions. So there are modules, there are thematic sessions and activities, and we go to the next one. This is booklet 2. Booklet 3 are activities for children. There are 16 daily interactions that parents, caregivers, educators can do with children. Very practical things that can be done in the day-to-day basis, even for a very busy parent and caregiver, but also more structured activities that can take a little bit more time, but are important to build the trust, to create this environment, to support the child to develop their spirituality. And activities can be developed in groups, for example, in educational settings, but also at individual level in the family. We go to the next booklet. is the guide for organizations, so how organizations can integrate it in their existing programs. So this is not yet another program, but it's really integrating in early childhood programs, parenting programs, and also contribute to the Sustainable Development Goals, to other frameworks that that organizations already use, the Nurturing Care Framework, and so on. So this is an explanation how to do it and integrate it. The next one is the guide for trainers. So this is how to conduct the training of trainers. And what we recommend is that the trainers are actually people from the organization, but also religious leaders that then can go and influence and cascade the model to others. So, you know, as religious leader here, Sheikh Letome, that is embedded in the community, he's an ideal trainer because he can champion this with others. We go next is the guide for facilitators. The facilitators are those that will work directly with the parents and caregivers, that are in constant relationship, maybe with parents and caregivers, and can work with them. And this is a very practical example of what they can do, how they can work with the parents and caregivers. There are examples of planning, how to deliver and evaluate the sessions. And if we go next, is the guide for religious and spiritual leaders. It's not so much as a guide, but it's really speaking on the role of religious and spiritual leaders. And we have spoke about this here, but also how the religious and spiritual leaders can support children's spiritual development through their sermons, through their work in the community, through the support to families, through social media, through advocacy. So there are different ways it can happen. And ends with the emphasizing the importance of interreligious dialogue and collaboration and action as ask us to move forward, because we believe that it's through this interfaith dialogue and collaboration that we can create better and safer spaces and environments for children to grow up. And the last part, there are resources. And we have the free book for parents and caregivers. We are aware that in many communities, parents do not have high level of literacy. So these are more drawings and pictures that can be used when training the parents and caregivers. And on the website, we have religious scriptures. This is being reviewed, will be added. We are adding more and more. It's how when you do the trainings and you work with religious leaders, which is some of the questions here on the chat, how do you talk with real leaders that think that, you know, they already have this knowledge? So what are the religious scriptures that are supportive of these positive social norms that are important to recall and to examine? And then next, which is my last slide, there is monitoring and evaluation as well, and some ideas on how to monitor and evaluate. And we are working with the Global Center for the Development of the Whole Child at the University of Notre Dame to develop a comprehensive framework and tools to monitor and evaluate these programs. As a consortium, we believe that this is a very unique tool that it will help us to integrate better the spiritual children in early childhood development. But of course, we need evidence on how this can be done, the impact this can have, how we can do it with parents and caregivers, and the role that religious communities can play. So that's it. There is if you can close the PowerPoint, there are the links to on the chat about to download it, and you can contact us. And I want to thank all the panelists, all the participants for a very interactive chat, and for the wonderful discussions, the wonderful reflections and recommendations. So thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. We look forward to continue this dialogue. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Maria Lucia.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye, Sister Grace.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Yeah,
Bye-bye. Bye-bye, Vinia, Chicletomi, and everyone who joined us. Thank you so much.
Bye.
Thanks, Maria.
Bye-bye. Masue, what's that?
Nagiba.
Nagiba.
Thanks, Vera.
I was there too. Thank you.
Bye, Masue.
Very nice to see you.
Thank you.